Welcome to the For Love and Money podcast, the show where business and social purpose meet to inspire a movement for positive change. Here's your host, Carolyn Butler-Madden.
Okay, my guest today has a long career in sustainability in Europe, the USA, Japan, and Australia. Carsten Primdal is a sustainability, ESG, business project and people manager. He is Chief Sustainability Officer and co-founder of Scertify, an organisation that he co-founded in 2021. Carsten is also author of the book, Roadmap to Modern Slavery Compliance. He's a supply chain risk specialist and a CSR and sustainability advisor, and he has extensive experience in assisting businesses from all over Europe, USA, Japan, Australia, and elsewhere in risk mitigation and compliance in supply chain. Carsten, welcome to the For Love and Money podcast.
Thank you, Carolyn. Very pleased to be here. Thank you for having me.
Good to have you here. So let's kick off. I want to ask you, the first question is, what does purpose mean to you?
Well, I think purpose is I mean, we all have to have purpose in our lives. And for me, purpose means that I do something that I really like, and something that has a positive impact on my family, first of all, of course, but also the planet and the people around me, including the people who manufacture the stuff that I'm using on a daily basis. So I think that's kind of how I would define purpose.
Thank you. And you talked about doing things that you like, so it rolls quite nicely into my next question, which is, what's your perspective on the idea, the role of love in business?
I think, of course, love is a sort of a loaded word, right? But in this context, I think it's for me, it's about doing what I love. I've made a decision to work in this field, not for the ability to make a lot of money or that kind of decision. I've made that decision because this is something I really like. And I think we all need to have that kind of motivator to do well and to deliver our best. So I think that's how I would say that it fits into business.
Thank you. And I guess it's about really caring about what you're doing.
Yeah,
isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And I really deeply care about that. I would say I love what I do.
And obviously, I've looked at your background and that you've got a long career in sustainability. So sustainability has become very, very relevant in recent times, but this is something that you've been involved with, over a long period in your career. So yes. It clearly comes from a place of passion.
Oh, it's something that comes from way back when. I was just about to say, when I was a kid, I was always very concerned with what was right and what wasn't right. And my grandfather was a policeman. And so initially it was about, you have to follow the law and you have to do what's right and don't be a baddie and be a goodie instead, right? But that sort of obviously evolves as you grow older and you realize that there's more aspects to it than just putting people in jail or not putting people in jail. It evolved, but that's sort of the early stages. Initially, I started out working with. Actually, my first job out of university was in the oil industry, so that's not a very sustainable business.
Oh wow!
But, that was many years ago, and it was in Denmark. I'm originally from Denmark, and the oil industry in Denmark came out of a need after the oil shock in the 70s. So there was a sustainability aspect to it, although the greenhouse effect wasn't really considered at that stage. It was more about energy supplies and sustainable energy supplies at a good price point. But I'd say that we still did follow some sustainability principles, because the license to actually get the oil field up and running, because we developed an oil field in the North Sea, and the license to get that had some environmental criteria attached to it that we very stringently needed to follow. They had recently made it illegal to flare all the gas that came up. The oil industry used to just flare the gas and only take the oil. And we were not allowed to do that. So we had to put all sorts of measures in place to make sure that that didn't happen. And then there was all sorts of issues around contamination, that there was limits of how much hydrocarbon you were allowed, or oil was allowed to be in the wastewater that went into the sea. So it had to be basically really, really clean. But of course, from a CO2
and this was back in the 70s.
No, no, that was in the 90s that I got my first job out of university. Yeah, I was born in the 70s.
I was going to say, what?
Yeah, no. The oil crisis obviously was in the 70s.
Got you. Okay.
And then a lot of Northern Europe did a big effort in trying to make themselves just independent of oil resources from elsewhere.
Okay, fantastic. I was scratching my head. Thinking,
no, I'm not that old.
You can't. Well, how does that work, right?
Yeah.
So that's where you started. I'd love you to share your journey. I'd love to understand how you've come to be doing what you're doing today.
Yeah, so I started out like any other university student, finding my way in the world, trying to find my first job, and I pretty quickly became aware that I wanted to do something different. And I after the oil company, so I was working in an engineering business, and I was responsible for developing some markets in mostly third world countries at that stage: India, Southeast Asia, Japan, etc. And I, on one of the journeys out there, so what we did was we would help for a fee companies get their products certified to sell into Europe. So it's an automotive engineering company, and you can't just sell like brake pads in without some sort of certification. You need to make sure that the product is fit for purpose, especially in vehicles that are dangerous if they don't have brakes. Right? So we would help manufacturers in these countries with getting their product certified to European standards so that they could actually market them. And on one of the visits to India, where I was meeting with a factory, a factory making brake pads, I arrived at the factory in the morning, and these kind of factory visits, they always have the same sort of pattern. You start out with a nice meeting with the management, a cup of tea, some sweets, and then they offer you a tour of the factories to really showcase how great they are. The managing director handed me over to somebody else, probably his nephew or something, and they started the factory tour, and we walk into this factory hall, which is I don't know, about 120 square meters, and there would have been probably about 100 people in there sitting there hunched over workstations. There's no natural light, no electric lights. They had some skylights in the ceiling, like what's called a plastic, those kind of plastic skylights, but they were totally sooty, so there's not a lot of light coming in, and these people just sitting there, and it was dusty and it was dirty, and most of them were bare feet because it was warm. And I'm looking at this and I'm like, oh, what's going on here? And I said, what material is it that you're using? They were sitting grinding these brake pads, because when they come out of the mold, they have some edges that needs to be ground off before you can actually fit them onto the vehicles or package them up. And say, oh, this is asbestos.
Oh my God!
Some sort of asbestos compound. Yeah. Take a step back. I'm like, I'm not sure I want to go into that room. But then I pretty quickly also realized, hang on, these people, 100 people, I can see through the door. They're in there probably 12, 14 hours every day, and they don't get to choose whether they want to go in or not. Or maybe they do get to choose, but then the choice is between having a job and not having a job. That made me think that these people, they are probably making not a lot in terms of salary or compensation for the work that they're doing. They're essentially signing over their health to in return for a very pittance of money. And who knows whether how many of those people are even alive today, right? It's that's 20 years ago, and that just made me think. I I mean, there's other examples, of course, as well in factories around these so-called low-cost sourcing nations, where you're thinking, wow, that looks really, really dangerous what they're doing there. I wonder what kind of insurance they would have to cover them later on if something happens. And that's probably, again, this is
probably none at all.
Probably none at all, yeah. So,
and this was around, when was this, Carsten?
That was in 2000.
Yeah, wow.
So it's not that long ago, and things have changed, but still, was there, and then the other thing that happened was that the guy who was showing me around, he saw the look on my face, and he said, "But don't worry, we're not going to sell asbestos product into Europe." And well, that doesn't really make it a lot better, right? I mean, you sell asbestos to your own population, they're okay with using this product that killed them. But the rich Europeans don't want it. Look, I think I think that's not really the morally acceptable to me. Something like this happening, so you either got to be following the same strict requirements towards everybody or nobody, right? And that's your own moral that dictates whether you want to do that, and the law of the country. And not, it's not always as dangerous as asbestos, right? But there's lots of other examples that could happen. so
that was a real moment of truth for you,
yeah,
I imagine.
Yeah, that was an eye-opener.
Yeah. So what happened? What came out of that?
Well, then I continued a little bit in the same tracks that I'd already been in. I still worked in compliance, but product compliance. And I saw more situations like this, and then eventually I got an opportunity to move to Japan, and I lived in Japan for a period of time, and I realized I really want to do something about this. So especially because on a personal level, my father actually died from a cancer caused by asbestos.
Wow.
And that made me think, this, and he didn't work with asbestos at all. He never did. But so he would probably just have inhaled it walking on the street, and that just made me think, look, this is not right. This is something we need to stop. And they're still, promoting asbestos in all of these countries, Indonesia, Vietnam, etc., in building products because it's cheap and it's efficient, and as long as you don't touch it too much, you don't inhale the dust, then it's it's safe as long as you don't touch it. But it's a bit unrealistic to expect that to happen. So it made me want to do something. So I educated myself as a social auditor for factory audits. And I did a 5-day training in Bulgaria, in Sofia in Bulgaria, and got the certification for what they call the social audit Rolls-Royce standard, which is called social accountability. SA 8000 is the name of the standard, in the same way as ISO 9000, ISO 14000 for environment, etc. So social accountability, they've made their own standard, and it's considered the sort of the gold standard in this field. And I educated myself in that, and then that subsequently led on to running a project in China, where I helped a large European retailer, big supermarket chain, set up their social compliance program in China with their supplier base. So we started with a pilot project, worked with 50 factories for 1 year. Straight off, we had to hire 8 people. I had to hire 8 people in China to help me run these programs on site in factories. And our approach was different because we took the capacity building approach rather than just the carrot and stick approach, which is audits. Most factories or most buyers will use audits extensively to check that the situation is as they expect. But audit also have the tendency to drive issues underground.
Right.
So that's not it's too single-sided just to do audits. There's a place for audits, but you have to apply more other methodologies as well to improve the situation. And one of these is capacity building. So we basically work with these 50 factories, visited them every 2 weeks, help them improve their systems, help them improve their production planning systems, engaging with their workers, calculating their wages in the right way, et cetera, et cetera. So it was a very interesting time, and it built up some experience that I'm very fortunate to have.
So, I mean, presumably with this, you were looking at bringing a certain level of ethical standards
Yes.
into their supply chain.
That's right.
First of all, when was this? And what I'm interested in understanding is, how did it go down, that balancing between profit and ethics?
Yeah. So this particular project started in early 2008 in China,
yeah.
but I did the training in Bulgaria in 2007. And I'm sure there was a profit element to it, because I would find it very hard to believe that particular client, and many other clients for that matter, would actually spend this kind of money on projects like this if it didn't actually also drive some profits, or perhaps if you look at it from the other side, that it cost them money if they didn't.
Yes.
So whether it's actually capturing an opportunity or mitigating a risk, I think it's probably the mitigation side that they did at that stage, whereas I think now that's changing into being just as much about opportunity. So and like in any organization, I think you have people who are strongly for, and you have some that are not as on board yet, and that was the case in this organization as well. They had some that really wanted to drive it, and they had some that were a little bit more reluctant and wanted to take it a little bit more slow. So, but bottom line still is that if it didn't have an impact on them somehow financially, then I would have some serious doubts as to whether they would have actually spent this kind of money on it.
Yeah.
Because it wasn't cheap. It's not cheap to set up a 9-person organization in China.
I can well imagine. I can well imagine it. But it sounds like their mindset was ahead of the market at the time.
Yes, they were some of the early movers on this. I would say. So without naming any names, it's actually funny, because there's always a tendency to go out in the market and scold the ones who are perhaps perceived to be the bad ones, and then heap lots of praise on the ones who are perceived to be the good ones. But it's not actually always like that. And in this particular situation, it was exactly the opposite. This was a discount retailer, and people saying, how can you sell a pair of jeans for $5 without making sure that or without having some exploitation? And that might be true. But they're also the first ones to actually spend money on looking into how do we solve this. Whereas a lot of the other ones who had profiles in the market already didn't spend money on it. So say whether that was foresight, or whether there was market pressure, or whether it was a combination, it's hard to say, right? But at the end of the day, I think the good part was that it moved forward. It moved the needle, at least a little bit. So it improved the working conditions for the workers in those factories. So,
absolutely. And so that's 2008. So where to from there?
Yeah, then I worked in China for a number of years. In 2012, end of 2012, my family and we decided to relocate to Australia. And when I arrived in Australia, I thought that there's going to be a need for these kind of things, because these kind of services, because European businesses are buying them. So why wouldn't Australian businesses be buying them? So I came here initially trying to set that up. It was a little bit of a hard slug initially to get Australian businesses on board, but fortunately I still had some good contacts in Europe, so it was possible to continue servicing European clients based on that until the Australian businesses caught on. But in Australia, I think the real sort of uptake of ESG issues have been in the last 2 to 3 years, especially when the Modern Slavery Act came into force, and first of all was announced, and then when it came into force, we're now sort of in the second iteration of the reporting cycles for most of the reporting entities, and that basically means that a lot of them are starting to look, oh, hang on, what are we going to write this year? We can't write the same as last year. What did we do? What can we do? How do we actually go out and fulfill our obligations here without just being waffly and issuing empty promises? Right? And that sort of leads us up to here today. In the meantime, I've been working with various different large Australian organizations, helping with trade compliance and sustainability issues. Worked in one of the big four banks. I worked with one of the big four consultancies for periods of time, and worked for a period of time with one of the airlines as well, and then the Catholic Church. And now I'm up to basically founding this business, Scertify. So.
And we're going to get to that in a moment, but
Yeah,
you skipped over something, and you touched on modern slavery, but you wrote your second book, Roadmap to Modern Slavery, which came out only a couple of years ago. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yes. So Roadmap to Modern Slavery and Sustainable Supply Chain came out in 2019. 2020 it came out. So it's 2 years now. So yeah, time flies, and all of a sudden they get mixed up. And my first book came out in 2015, end of 2015. So I wrote that book because I, first of all, could see that the act was coming, and second of all, because I wanted to get my version of the story out there, my experience in the supply chain out there, because I found that there's a tendency to focus on certain aspects of what we can do. At the moment, modern slavery is very much driven by human rights lawyers. And all respect for human rights lawyers, they're wonderful people. They have a keen interest in this area, but they haven't necessarily been working with the factories on the side. So I think that there's a case to be made that if you want to address an issue, you need to have all the relevant skills, in the same way as military platoon, where you have somebody who is responsible for radio communication, and somebody who is responsible for medical, and somebody who is responsible for whatever artillery or something. Actually, I was never in the military myself, so I can't speak like an expert, but I know that there's a division of labor, right? And I think the same thing applies here. We need to make sure that we have the right skill sets for the right jobs, so that we can actually solve these issues, because that's what matters. But what really matters is that we need to help the victims, right? I mean, it's a business imperative, but it's about, at the end of the day, or at the beginning of everything, or at the end of the day, whichever way you want to look at it, it's about the victim. It's about making sure that the victims can be freed and that they can get on with their lives in a way that allow them to live a fruitful life like we all want. And if that means that the business ends up doing good as well in the same situation, then that's to me, it's an added bonus.
And that I mean, your book came out at exactly the right time, obviously. When, tell us about the Modern Slavery Act. When did that come into force, and what is the expectation from it?
Yeah, so the Modern Slavery Act came into force on the 1st of January 2020. It was agreed about a year and a half before that, and then enacted. And basically what it does is that it sets a threshold for large businesses, not just Australian businesses, but any business who operates in Australia, to report if their revenue, global revenue, exceeds a certain threshold. That threshold is $100 million. So if a big, say a company from my home country, Denmark, has more than $100 million Australian dollar turnover, and they have a small office in Australia with only a little turnover, they still have to report here.
Yeah.
So the act actually captures both Australian business and external, which is good, and it's intended to drive transparency. It's a law that obliges businesses to disclose what kind of risks they see in their business when it comes to modern slavery, and disclose what they're doing to address the risk, and to disclose some sort of measure on the effectiveness, because the understanding is that you can't address an issue which is hidden without trying to improve your transparency. So that's what that law is about, and it's basically it's trying to put cascade the responsibility from large businesses onto smaller businesses, because if you want to report, you want to make sure that your suppliers are also giving you the information that you need to report, which is why they're cascading it down the chain. And so far, there's been both good and bad examples of statements, mostly bad, unfortunately.
Oh, really?
Well, look, it's easy to be critical, and at the end of the day, it's about having the right information available, right? And the systems are not really set up for that yet. So it's understandable that the statements are not really at the 100% yet. But then again, there's also a lot who just submit a one-page statement saying we do not have slavery. And if you submit a one-page statement, it's hard to address the risk. It's hard to say what you've done. And that becomes more of a sort of a statutory declaration. We don't have slavery, or we don't condone it. But who does? At the end of the day, nobody does, right? Unless you're part of a criminal syndicate. But that's
so it's about doing the work, the deep work.
That's right.
To really uncover all the threads in your organization,
right,
and start to address the problem rather than just tick boxes.
Exactly. It's about understanding. It's about prying open that box and start looking inside and figuring out what is it that we're looking at. That level we haven't quite reached yet. At the moment, it's very much about what is the inherent risk level. For example, looking at what is the country risk of buying textile from Bangladesh, and everybody will say that's high, but that is not necessarily the case for your particular factory, right? It's every factory, every business is slightly different. So cutting everybody across the same template, so to speak, is a bit simplifying. It's a bit simplification, and that doesn't really work, I think. So,
and it seems to me it's a mindset shift, and we're going through this huge mindset shift with business, aren't we?
Yes.
Where the role of business has always been, or has been for the last 50 years, about maximizing profit, maximizing shareholder return. And this shift that is taking place, which is being driven by the market, is no, business has to serve all stakeholders. Profit is important, but it can't be the driving force, at the cost of other stakeholders. So this mindset shift is never going to happen overnight, is it? It's
no.
We're going to need a few generations maybe to die, or a generation to die out. But there are some very forward-thinking companies who are showing us that business
100%.
Can do the right thing and can be successful.
Yes.
As a result.
I totally agree. I think it is about shifting the mindset. I think the majority of people have started to shift the mindset now, and what we've seen recently as well is that whereas 10 years ago this was very much an issue of mitigating risk, a risk to the business, now it's become an issue of, it's still about mitigating risk, but it's also about making sure that investors are still willing to invest, because there's becoming more and more prevalent that investors are looking into these kind of risks. So how are you managing these risks? And if you're not, then your business might essentially be too risky for us, because it's a matter of knowing the risk and managing as big a proportion of the overall risk as possible, not just tiny little snippets here and there, or just financial risk, or whatever other risk it is that they're looking at. And then the other part of it is that, and that's sort of perhaps you could even use it as a revenue driver, or at least as a revenue preserver, that if you have these controls in place that you can manage this risk, then you also know your supply chain a lot better. And by knowing your supply chain better, you can also make improvements. And that's where the opportunity side comes in. And if you can actually start capitalizing on some of these opportunities, then you are doing good by doing good. And who doesn't want to do that? I mean, show me somebody who don't want to do that, then I'll be very surprised if anybody can show me somebody who don't want to do that. I mean,
Absolutely.
one of the examples that I've heard very recently is one of the big mining companies who here in Australia who decided to go in and implement a system that could certify or validate that the product was made under certain labor conditions. And they actually managed, by doing that and by guaranteeing that to their customers, they were able to not only gain market share, but they could also gain a price premium. So say, I'm not going to get into the exact numbers that I heard, but just as an example, say if you can gain 10% market share and a 3% premium, then you won. So just by doing that, and then people say, yeah, but this is hugely expensive, and well, yes, it is hugely expensive if you go with McKinsey to do it for you, but you don't need McKinsey to do all these things. You don't need people who are just sitting in their ivory towers and doing all the theoretical stuff. You need people on the ground. They're not necessarily that expensive. And even so, it's not about putting in a team of 20 people. It's perhaps one or two.
So it's looking at it in a different way. And I think this brings us nicely to your current venture, Scertify. Yeah. So can you tell us about Scertify?
Yes, absolutely.
Enjoying the podcast? If you're looking for more inspiration, head to our website, thecauseeffect.com.au, for more resources on how you can start using your business as a force for good. Or buy the For Love and Money book. Every copy sold allows us to protect 1 square metre of rainforest. Help us save 10,000 square metres by 2025.
Scertify is a business that I co-founded last year with 2 Americans, and the idea is that, so I have the sustainability background and they have the technology background, and basically we wanted to marry up the skills and work to digitize sustainability in a way that we can focus on the really impactful stuff that only humans can do, and get the machines to do all the analysis that we don't find very interesting as human beings to do. And there isn't a lot of that out there at the moment. So we want to try to marry those 2 disciplines into a service offering to businesses, so that it becomes easier for the sustainability teams to manage their supply base and not spending time on all the boring tasks, but actually spending their time where it matters and where it's interesting. Because as a sustainability individual, I'm working with this area because I like it and because I love it, not because of the rewards or the monetary rewards that are involved in it. And I think most people in sustainability come from that background. I mean, there's been a tendency to people in sustainability coming from perhaps more of an NGO background kind of thing, which means that people really love what they do. But even so, there's a limit to how much of these kind of basic admin tasks that you can do without getting bored.
Yes.
So we want to take that part away and just leave the really interesting stuff to the people, so that people can feel, wow, I've really made an impact today. And that's the point of Scertify.
Brilliant. And so how do you do that?
Well, so one of my co-founders, he's a data architect, so he's really good at I share my experience on how do I evaluate a supplier, and then he breaks it down into little pieces of data that is then structured in a way that we can put it into a piece of software or an algorithm that can help us do some predictive analysis and create some dashboards so that people who perhaps don't understand so much about this can gain some base level understanding of it, and without necessarily having to hire a lot of people like myself or other sustainability experts, and use the resources that they have on asking questions to the more complex cases, because of course there's things you can't automate. I think sustainability is very much about getting the documentation in order, the data. It's about that intuition and gut feel, you might say, and then of course also about documenting and validating the information you have. And part of it you can automate and part of it you can't. So So you should automate whatever you can and leave the rest to the team. And the other way we do it is by we're rolling out in Asia Pacific this training called competent boards. And competent boards is basically about educating boards and senior executives to understand ESG. So it's called Competent Boards ESG Training, and we kind of think that it all starts with the board and with the management. If there's no buy-in from them, if there's no understanding how important these issues are, then it's not going to move anything in the business. So I mean, there's resources that are needed, there's support that's needed, and buy-in. In order to do that, we think that ESG training for board and executives is a really important thing. So,
okay, I'm going to ask you to tell us more about that in a moment. But just for now, ESG, environmental social governance. It's a term we're hearing much more frequently now. It's become very, very common, but yes, not everybody, I believe, understands the scope of what it is. So just for someone who's familiar with the term but doesn't really understand deeply what it means, can you give a explanation?
So, yes, absolutely. So essentially, the E is for environment, the S is for social, and G is for governance, like you said. But under each of those three buckets, there's or pillars, there's some additional issues. So, for example, under environment, you have issues of waste and waste reduction, waste disposal. You have issues of carbon, like CO2 emissions and greenhouse gases. You have safe management of chemicals. You have oceans and land and land rights. Under social, you say the land rights that I just mentioned under environmental kind of spills over into the social, because without land rights, the poor in third world and developing countries have no means of sustaining themselves. So that's a social aspect as well. Social is about having living wages, or wages that you can live from. So there's a difference between what is a minimum wage and what is a living wage. Minimum wage is a legal construct, but a minimum wage does not necessarily provide you everything you need to put your kids through school and having enough for hospital treatment, etc. So living wage is actually what we're striving for, so that people have some discretionary income that they can use for these unforeseen expenses and don't need to work 16 hours every day to make ends meet. It's about safety and thriving communities, about diversity and equality and health. And of course about slavery, because nobody should be forced to work in a situation where they are exploited by somebody else for either profit or other types of gratification.
Yeah.
And then there's the governance side of things, and that relates into stuff like money laundering, bribery and corruption. It relates into tax and investment. Businesses have an obligation to pay their taxes in a fair and equitable way so that they're supporting the societies where they operate. And then ethics in general, and making sure that there's oversight provided. So that's kind of broadly the three categories under ESG. And then there's, of course, what this podcast is about, purpose. And I think that purpose ties really nicely into ESG, or rather, not just ties in, it's almost integral, because there's no way you can do ESG without purpose, and there's no way you can do purpose without ESG. If you define your purpose in business, you live it out through what you do in the space of ESG. And the other way around, if you have an ESG program, it's because you're living by some sort of values that defines your purpose. So it ties really nicely together, purpose and sustainability.
And it's really interesting because my experience is businesses usually sort of start with one thing, and the very act of using your business as a vehicle to do good seems to generate the sense of, I want to do more. I want to look at more ways that I can, do good through the business. So it just, like you say, it's intrinsically interlinked, but, one action begets more, and you start looking at different areas that you can do good. So
exactly. I think it's exactly just like you said, there's a bit of a sort of a hands-off approach to begin with when people are a little bit scared and say, how do we get started on this? And it's probably, there's the mountain in front of me. How am I going to scale it, right? But I mean, one step at a time leads you to want to take the next one. And once you know how to take those steps, then it becomes easier, and it's not so daunting once you get started. I mean, it's not rocket science, right? It's just about thinking, applying some thinking to it, and then everybody can do it. I think it's just another way to the goal, right?
Yes. And to bring and I think to bring business back onto the path that I believe it's supposed to be on. I feel like, business has taken a wrong turn. Going down the road 40, 50 years ago of shareholder capitalism felt like a wrong turn on a road. I recently watched the Netflix documentary on Boeing, and I don't know if you've seen it, but if you haven't seen it, and for listeners, please watch it. It is a masterclass in showing a company that was built on trust and pride and safety, how, when they merged and really just started being driven by the dollar, purely by profits, just went downhill. They went down this wrong path. And I think that's true of business widely. So it's about action and taking that first step to bring you back to fulfill what I believe is the true potential of business, which is to serve society's needs and to be a force for good and to be profitable so that everybody wins.
Yes, I couldn't agree more. I think that's exactly it. I mean, we're all shareholders through our superannuation funds and pension schemes and whatever else we have. I mean, what's the point of having a really fat account with your pension account somewhere if you've sold your health away and die early, right? It's no point. So I mean, this is definitely about having that right balance. And unfortunately, we're starting to see that the various different pension funds are really attaching a lot of emphasis to this, because they want to see that these things are managed in a balanced way. It's not all about profit, and it's not all about making money. It's about fulfilling the purpose.
Absolutely. But the interesting thing is those pension funds, the super funds, the ethical superannuation funds are the fastest growing sector, not just in superannuation, but in financial services generally. One of my earlier guests on this podcast was Simon Sheikh, who is co-founder of Future Super. And it's a thoroughly interesting interview about what many just normal superannuation funds, where their investments are going that we don't know about. And what ethical super funds, how they're performing, really shows us the future where this is going.
Absolutely, it's becoming more and more. So it's something that's really on the front of mind for all of them, which is good. I think it's to everybody's benefit.
It's why you and I are in business, isn't it?
Exactly.
So let's get into the detail now of the Competent Boards program. Tell us about it. Tell us first about the program. What is it?
Yeah, so Competent Boards is a program that was developed in the US, not by me. I'm a delivery partner here in Australia, and it was developed by Competent Boards in the US / Canada, and they've been running it for 2.5 years now. Launched at Davos in 2019. And they've got some really heavy hitters endorsing it, like Paul Polman from former CEO of Unilever, Johan Rockström from the Potsdam Institute of Climate, etc. And what it is that it's a recognition that without education, the boards and the senior executives who have spent their entire lives doing profit-driven and operational risk and all the other traditional business disciplines, how they all of a sudden going to learn some brand new skills. So, and if they can't learn those brand new skills somewhere in a practical manner without going back to university, because there's lots of university courses out there that helps with ESG training, but they don't have time to do a whole university course. So they need something else. So competent boards is basically a collection of fireside chats. There's a curriculum developed together with University of Oxford and Arizona State University, and then some online sessions over 24 weeks that the participants go through. So it's pretty comprehensive, and the speakers are really high level. And then at the end, it leads to a designation that people can basically use to showcase that they understand ESG, and they've had the privilege of going through a training that allow them to think critical about these issues. So that's what competent boards is, and I think that's the first place that any business needs to start. It's all good to hire somebody to be the sustainability person, but if nobody else understands what that person is doing, then there's not going to be buy-in from the organization. There's not going to be enough support. There's not going to be understanding for why they're doing it, and that just doesn't lead to a good result. So by having the senior level of the business understanding and enabling them to think critically about this, they also know how to drive it. And that means that you get the right people into the right positions and you get the right support. And that means you can achieve things that impact.
And yeah, that's, I mean, it's vital, isn't it, that it's actually driven by the board. Otherwise, yes, it's just an uphill battle. So whether you're driving ESG and purpose, from a sustainability perspective or a people and culture perspective or a marketing perspective,
yeah,
you're never going to get the traction across the organization that you need if you don't have the endorsement, the buy-in and of the board. And in order to have that, they have to have the knowledge.
Yes,
and the understanding of what needs to be done. So this is vital.
The other thing I think that perhaps is really important when it comes to a training program, it has to be comprehensive and it has to cover every single area, because as we know, in Australia, there's a lot of emphasis on gender equality and getting women into boards and their organizations that help promote women, for example. And gender diversity is one aspect of ESG, but it's not the only one.
Yeah.
I mean, there's another aspect of diversity is to source from Aboriginal sources, right? But you got to have that whole understanding of the entire landscape before you can start drawing a map of where you're going. And I think that's what this does. It helps you. Fantastic.
And it also brings participants together who can exchange ideas, I imagine.
Yes, exactly. So it's so every session is rounded out by an online session. It's online, so it's for the whole region. So we have people signed up from India, from Hong Kong, from Australia, New Zealand, etc. So it's all online, but there's every thematic unit is rounded out with an online session where there's some speakers and or not really speakers, but there's some industry professionals who are there to engage in a conversation with the attendees, so they can ask questions and be a breakout rooms to discuss specific issues. So there's some interaction, and then of course there's a network afterwards that they can be used as a way for sparring.
Brilliant. So who should do the program?
Well, so it's senior executives and board members primarily. It's fairly senior level, so we're not saying that it has to be C-suite necessarily, but it's not for entry level people, and potentially depend on where sort of in the middle of the organization and what sort of buy-in from the rest of from the upper levels of the organization there is. It could be possible as well, but it's it's by application, and competent boards in the US actually vet applicants to make sure that the cohort of students is maintained, so that the networking opportunities afterwards can be fully fruitful to everybody, in the same way that all the speakers are vetted by competent boards as well, to make sure that the qualities are there.
And I suppose that is the vetting of the applicants, I imagine, is that to ensure that people aren't just doing this as a tick box?
Partly, but it's also to filter out. So, for example, competent boards don't want people who are straight out of university to do this.
Yeah.
I mean, unless they have some other life experience in the bag before that, but
Yeah.
not the typical 23-year-old straight out of university or 24-year-old is not it's not for them. It's for people
Yeah.
who have experience in business and who have reached a certain level of seniority and demonstrated results, so that it's I mean, we want to have practical discussions, not hypothetical or theoretical discussions. And we can only get that by actually having people in the room who know how to get to the point in a pretty straight and concise manner.
And presumably you need to be on a board?
If you want to attend, there's two streams. So there's a board stream and there's an executive stream. And the reason for that is that the board stream, the attendees at the board stream tend to have slightly different line of questioning compared to the executives. So to facilitate the discussion and make sure that everybody get the maximum out of it, we split it into these two streams. So for the board stream, yes. And if you don't have a board role, then it's the executive stream. Okay,
brilliant. And so for listeners of this podcast, you know, if you're on a board, then definitely this is something to look at. If you're a senior executive with experience, again, this is something to look at. But even if if you don't fit the bill of those two criteria, you're an influencer. You know, who can you influence? Who would benefit from this? Think about that, and we will include on the show notes links to this program. And yeah, I can tell you it is absolutely comprehensive. So very well worth a look and well worth sharing with others who you think could get value out of it. And let's face it, who wouldn't get value out of something like this now in business at a board level or executive level? So with that, I also...
Everybody should do this at the moment, because we need a base level of understanding to discuss these issues, and at the moment that base level is just not there.
So why else? Why should someone do it? Why now?
Yeah, because it's such a hot topic in the market at the moment. ESG, you hear it everywhere, and that's both good and bad, of course. When somebody something gets too hot, there's also an influx of people who are trying to make a quick buck on it. But that's why it's even more important to actually be really skilled on what is up and what is down. So making sure that whatever influence where you're taking your influence from is really critical. And I think that, I mean, I've seen examples of some offering out there where you say, but the person who's speaking here doesn't have any experience in this field. And so that's like me walking in and starting to perform dentist's work in the dentist's clinic.
Oh my God, that's frightening. That's frightening.
Right. That is frightening, right? So you want the real people to help you, right? There's no qualifications for this. There's no licensing scheme. So in that sense, anybody can do it. So it makes it even more important to do a due diligence on who it is that you're dealing with.
Yeah. So can you tell us what can a participant expect to get out of it?
Yeah, so the feedback is overwhelming. That actually there's 100% of people who attended in this training who recommend it. So I don't know how many other trainings have that kind of
that's amazing
rating. Yeah, and everybody that I've spoken to are really raving about it. So it's kind of one of those things that sells itself by word of mouth, basically. Of course, you can expect to get an understanding of ESG issues. So there's 12 modules. They're focused on different areas. One is on, for example, slavery and supply chain human rights. One is on climate issues. One is on diversity issues. So it's 12 trainings that basically covers everything you need to know. So that's what you get out of it, a knowledge base, and then you get a designation. So that is something that obviously can be used on a resume, on LinkedIn profile, whatever, and then you get the network.
Brilliant.
Yeah, it's a little bit like a mini MBA in sustainability or ESG.
Fantastic. And look, we're not going to talk pricing on this, but you shared with me the pricing, and the value for money it's unquestionable. So yeah, I think this is brilliant. I think it is something, it's a program that is needed right now. And, when you see the latest Edelman Trust Barometer findings, for example, which show that societal leadership is now a core expectation of business.
Yes.
It is expected that CEOs take a stand on societal issues. I just don't believe you can afford to take a superficial approach to this. And the Competent Boards program really leads you through the key aspects, and getting a clear understanding of what you need to do in those areas. So 24 weeks, 12 modules. And I believe you're also offering a discount for our listeners.
That's right. So anybody who wants to sign on to this can get a 10% discount, quoting the discount code FLAM, for love and money, to make it easy to remember. FLAM would welcome any application.
Brilliant. Thank you. We'll put all those details in the show notes as well. So thank you. I want to ask you a couple of final questions. So just for business leaders who are considering their purpose or their ESG journey, what apart from saying yes, look at the program, but what's some general advice you would have for them?
Well, I'll definitely say that step number one, if you're not very familiar with ESG or don't have an ESG or sustainability person in your organization, it's really important that you try to educate yourself on this, and whether that is reading or whether that's going on to, for example, Responsible Investment Association, Australasia, RIA have a lot of resources. And while it is the Responsible Investment Association, a lot of them are really applicable to running businesses as well. So have a look in all of their materials in there. It might give you most of an angle from the investor side of things, but thinking about it, you can very easily flip it around and say, okay, that means I need to do this, this, and this. So there's lots of resources available out there. You can probably educate yourself. It's going to take a little bit longer compared to if you do a program, right, with some structured information. So I think that's the first step. Get educated. And then, of course, say, provided that, given that you're listening to this podcast, you already know about purpose and have an interest in that. So I would assume that you have an idea of where you're moving with your purpose, or want to have an idea. So I'd say get clear on what is the purpose of your business, and then figure out then how do you achieve that, right? Because once you have your purpose clear, you also can start thinking, okay, which area on the ESG should I try to apply my resources to? Because there's a lot of areas you can apply your resources to, and probably you can't do it at all, unfortunately. As much as this pains me to say, you probably can't do all. It is a journey, and I think so it's really about finding out what is the best area. For me, the best area obviously is modern slavery, right? Because I've seen kids in factories in China, and I've helped remediate cases of these things. So for me, that's really something that burns in my heart, right? But for others, it might be the climate aspect of things. For others, again, it might be making sure that there's enough indigenous participation in your business, etc. So it's all about choosing, and it's try not to exclude. But of course, any choice means also a choice of not choosing something else, especially if there's not resources to do everything. And then perhaps also look at where could there potentially be some opportunities in this. Because I think that opportunities are rife in this area. It's once you start thinking about things from a slightly different angle, you will realize that, hang on, there was this, I hadn't thought about that before. Maybe that's an opportunity, and maybe that can drive some additional revenue or some additional growth that we can then turn into some other initiatives that can do that and drive your purpose and your impact through that way.
Brilliant. Brilliant. Thank you, Carsten. And yeah, I guess your particular passion for modern slavery takes us right back to that story you shared with us about touring that Indian factory.
Yes.
So that connects. Yeah. There's a very clear connection to, you know, your life experiences and how that's really molded, shaped your purpose.
Exactly.
In life. So I just want to finish up with a final question, which I know will be deeply relevant to you. We're 2022 recording this interview, and the target date for the UN Global Goals is 2030. That's 8 years, only 8 years. We're getting closer and closer. And as a member of the generation who actually has the privilege to take action, we have the opportunity to take action, unlike probably future generations following in our footsteps. Do you have a message for the business leaders of our generation today?
Yes, I think, like you said, time is really short. And while we all grew up with that, we have to set aspirational targets because otherwise we're not going to move fast enough forward. I think this is really imperative. Everybody's moving on this at the moment. So I say those who don't are probably in danger of being left behind when we reach 2030. And from my perspective, obviously with the business I set up, Scertify, we want to make sure that these issues get measured so that they can get managed. So I say, and this is one of the key shortcomings in reviewing all the different modern slavery statements that are up on the government register that I've done. There's very little measurements in it, very much aspiration, very little actual concrete evidence of anything. So I'd say get firm on starting to measure your aspects, and it doesn't have to be the full package to start with. Start with something. And like you said before, Carolyn, once you get started, then it's 1 foot ahead of the next, and you realize I can do this and I can do that. So start thinking about that, because that's the only way we're going to move forward. And I don't think history will judge us very kindly if we don't move forward. So,
Carsten Primdal, thank you very much for taking the time to speak with us. I've really enjoyed chatting to you.
Likewise. Thank you, Carolyn. And thank you for listening in, everybody.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the For Love and Money podcast. If you'd like to take a deeper dive into the purpose movement, visit us at thecauseeffect.com.au. And remember, doing good is good for business. So if you're not doing good, then what are you doing?